In November 1990, Margaret Thatcher left Downing Street for the last time, forced out against her will by her closest colleagues in cabinet.
One after another. Of course, if you wish to stand, I'll support you. But I don't think you can win. And I think, therefore, you should let other people stand and stand down.
During her time in Downing Street, Margaret Thatcher had fought and won many battles with the establishment, with the unions, with the opposition, but above all, with her cabinet. But now she'd lost the final battle with her Conservative colleagues, and in losing, she felt bitterly betrayed.
It was treachery with a smile on its face. Perhaps that was the worst thing of all.
On the 4th of May 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first woman Prime Minister. For the next 11 years, in her own words, her life was to be a daily battle. As a politician, she had one simple obsession: to reverse Britain's decline.
I knew our policies were right. I knew that when you change from one set of policies, which people got used to another, the transition is very difficult. I knew that all of the difficulties would arise first, and that we would nevertheless have to stick to our policies because the benefits would come in the longer run.
I'm just aware of the very great responsibility, but it's very exciting, and somehow one is very calm about it, because you have to be. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Thank you.
She'd been pestering me all through the election to give her something to say on the steps of number 10, if by any chance she was the winner. And I'd always refused to do so. On the victory night, at 4 o'clock in the morning, she said, "Well, now will you tell me what you have in mind?" And I said, "Yes, it's the prayer of St. Francis, which begins, where there is discord, may I bring harmony," and so on for 3 or 4 lines. I looked up to see her reaction, and to my amazement, the tears were streaming down her face.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Hello. Have a word.
We had thought that there had been so much discord, and our policies were built very much on the faith and the principles which we'd formulated, and it was the hopes of the people that had put us there, which is why I chose those words of St. Francis of Assisi.
And I would just like to remember some words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope. And to all the British people, howsoever they voted, may I say this: now that the election is over, may we get together and strive to serve and strengthen the country of which we are so proud to be a part.
And in the middle of all this, she finally got it out, but not in the most elegant manner. It was impossible. It was bedlam. Here was the first woman Prime Minister. But she said it, and it went round the world. But the people who had said, "Be careful," were not wrong. It was thrown back at her from time to time, when everything was not hope and despair was not dispelled, and so forth. But I think it was perfectly okay. It was a hope, and it was a powerful one, and a noble one, I thought.
Oh, that was the most awful humbug. I mean, it was so alien to Margaret's beliefs about things. And I think one of the problems about the Thatcher years is that we have become a more selfish society. And for her to talk about bringing harmony where there is conflict and so on, I mean, is the most unutterable nonsense from that particular person. That wasn't what she was about at all.
Morning, Lord Carrington. What brings you here? The boss. The boss.
Coffee, and then they want us all out. Can I just explain, in case you should think anything different? The people I've got coming have no particular great significance, or those who are not here. They're the ones who are in London this weekend.
It's like coming out of the bloody zoo.
As leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher had accepted the need to unite the party and reflect all strands of opinion in her shadow cabinet. A leadership battle 4 years before had left the Conservative Party deeply divided between those on the left of the party, who'd backed the former Prime Minister Edward Heath, and those on the right of the party, who'd voted for Margaret Thatcher. In forming her first cabinet, she relied above all on the guidance of Willie Whitelaw. He advised her to continue to work with her enemies as well as her friends. Many of her most bitter opponents were summoned to Number 10 to be offered jobs.
It's far better to have them with you, even though they try to slow you down, than it is to have them on the back benches arguing against you, influencing other people against you, instead of accepting the policies. After all, we only had a majority of 45, and we were new.
Prominent amongst her opponents was the Defence Secretary Francis Pym, the former Chief Whip and a confidant of Ted Heath. Although he was happy to accept the call to cabinet, he found Margaret Thatcher's right-wing radicalism distasteful. He, like many of his colleagues, intensely disliked her style and manner.
She asked you? Yes. Well, not actually. The point about Mrs. Thatcher is that she was against any suggestion of compromise, which meant that she had a confrontational style. That was the automatic consequence of it. And the idea that somebody else might have a valid point of view, which might be a right point of view, wouldn't enter her mind at all. No part of her philosophy.
Sir Ian Gilmore, a grandee like Francis Pym, was another opponent of the Prime Minister. He considered her a reactionary and too right-wing for a party of consensus. He thought her judgment was totally misguided.
Quite a lot of the time, she clearly was sort of hyped up a great deal. I thought a lot of the things she said were not right, although she very seldom actually said a sentence in itself that was interesting, rather surprisingly in all those years. But I thought she was fevered and very often irrational.
Jim Pryor, another landowner, became Margaret Thatcher's employment secretary. Pryor was a heavyweight Heathite with a ferocious temper. Like many of his colleagues on the left of the party, he was appalled by Margaret Thatcher's manner.
The Thatcher cabinet was never a very happy cabinet. I always remember a remark made by Christopher Soames, who sat in the Macmillan cabinet, never sat in the Heath cabinet, and then came back into the Thatcher cabinet for having been an outsider for a number of years. And he made a rather sort of patrician remark after the first cabinet, at which Margaret had torn a strip off one member of the cabinet. And Christopher Soames said to me, he said, "I wouldn't even treat my gamekeeper like that."
Underlying the tension between Margaret Thatcher and many in the establishment was an acute sense of class. Although Margaret Thatcher was married to a successful businessman and was by no means poor, she was fiercely loyal to her humble origins as the daughter of a grocer in Grantham, and often scornful of upper-class men. As a colleague once observed, she thought all men feeble and gentlemen more feeble than most.
She said, "You know, Tony, I'm very proud that I don't belong to your class." I said, "Prime Minister, what class do you think I belong to?" And she said, "I'm talking, of course, about upper middle class intellectuals who see everybody else's point of view and have none of their own. Well, I thought that was an extremely humorous remark.
Margaret Thatcher regarded her patrician colleagues as typical of the feckless English upper classes. She called them the not-so-grand grandees, and suspected that they mistrusted her both as a woman, that woman as some called her, and as a lower middle-class woman to boot.
Yes, well, I know that some of them describe me as that woman. Did it matter what they called me, so long as I got the job done? I mean, to me, they were those grandees, or they just don't know what life is like. They haven't been through it. And eventually, if they didn't help our cause, they had to go. But it didn't bother me too much that they were a little bit patronizing like that. Frankly, the people who are the true gentlemen deal with others for what they are, not for who their father was. Let's face it, maybe it took that woman to get things done, and the real reason why they said it, because they knew they just hadn't got it within them to see things through.
There wasn't this phalanx of allegedly superior snobbish people. It's a figment of Mrs. Thatcher's fevered imagination. This group didn't exist, except that we felt the same, but we never met as a group, and the majority of them never opposed her.
The fact that she was a woman added to the sense of unease in the establishment.
Plenty of height, Colin.
Politics in those days and government in those days was very much a man's world. And to have a woman running it was a very considerable departure. And I think it was difficult for her to establish herself to begin with, because she was a woman. And I think she did exactly the right thing. I think that she dominated it. And I think that was the only conceivable way she would have survived, was because she realized that she had to dominate it if she was going to be the only woman, broadly speaking, either in government or in the civil service who was in any position of authority.
I suppose, looking back on it, I found it difficult. I mean, at the time, one was determined, she was Prime Minister, and one was determined to go along with her and to give her every possible support. But it was when she started to become dictatorial and tapping her pencil at Cabinet and I think being totally unreasonable in a number of the things she tried to do, that one really got very fed up indeed. And then I suppose one began to think, well, is it because she's a woman and you're a man?
It never occurred to me that I was a woman Prime Minister. My reactions as to whether it was like her might have been those of a woman. It never occurred to me that I was a woman. I was Prime Minister. It was the greatest honour that can come to a British person, to have been given this, and I'd been put there because I would change things. So I had better get on with making the change.
To the new Prime Minister, change was essential if Britain's decline was to be reversed. Evidence of that decline seemed to surround her in the rubbish piled up during the strikes of the Winter of Discontent, in Britain's poor economic performance, and in its diminishing prestige abroad.
I can't bear Britain in decline. I just can't. We who either defeated or rescued half Europe, who kept half Europe free, when otherwise it would be in chains. And look at us now.
In Margaret Thatcher's view, the years of post-war liberal consensus had allowed a creeping socialism to strangle British enterprise. Her own party, the Conservatives, had adopted the very same policies as the Labour Party and had failed.
It was the old way that had got us into trouble. It was the old way that had been responsible for our decline. It was because no one had had the guts to put it right that I was faced with the problem I was. But there were, oh no, it's too difficult. And it wasn't.
Margaret Thatcher relied on two colleagues above all for her economic policies, her Chancellor, Sir Geoffrey Howe, and her Industry Secretary, Sir Keith Joseph.
It was Karl Marx who had more effect on the world in his writing life than any other person in the last 150 years. And how did he have the time?
Keith Joseph rejected the consensus of the post-war years, urging that the control of inflation and not the defeat of unemployment should be the object of policy.
By the patronage of a Manchester businessman,
He converted Mrs. Thatcher to monetarism, the theory that the control of the money which the government prints and spends would inevitably lead to the control of inflation. But in his words, monetarism was not enough.
We were overgoverned, overtaxed, over-borrowed, overmanned, under-defended, under-policed, and rather badly educated. And those were, as it were, the first obvious targets. There were plenty of others.
If you took the whole thing all of a piece, it really was like trying to run up a down escalator. And so we had to do just that. It can be done if you're very firm. And my goodness me, Geoffrey Howe never flinched from taking the tough decisions.
The key there was to switch the tax structure, as we had advertised, away from taxes pay as you earn to taxes pay as you spend. The tax switch from taxes on income to taxes on expenditure, alongside a program for reining back government expenditure and as widespread a removal of controls as we could.
Sir Geoffrey Howe introduced an emergency budget in June 1979. Despite a world economic downturn, he doubled VAT and raised interest rates in line with the Thatcherite monetarist policy. The British economy plunged into recession.
In those early months, that summer of '79, right after the election, I was somebody who would have liked her to have changed her rhetoric and said to the nation, we are going to carry out the plans upon which you elected us, but we are now in a situation where the world is going into a recession, and it is bound to take us longer than we expected we would at the election. I would have been totally candid about that. But as you know, that didn't happen. We went on exactly as we were without any sort of hindrance whatsoever from the point of view of the world circumstances having changed, and I think that was a pity.
Margaret Thatcher was resolved that the new philosophy would not be watered down to fit changing circumstances. Every fibre of her being rejected the idea of the post-war consensus that had shaped British politics for 3 decades.
She said, you know, she'd never met me really before, she said, you know, there are people in my party who still believe in consensus politics. And I said, well, Mrs. Thatcher, an awful lot of people in Britain, including myself, feel the same. I've been a consensus man ever since I can remember. To which she replied, looking at me very hard, no, she said, there is no consensus. I call them quislings, I call them traitors. Hard words, I replied. And she said, maybe, but they are appropriate.
You know, if you look at the great philosophies and ideas which have moved the world, if you look at the great religions, and the Judeo-Christian religion really has been the origin of human rights and the significance of the individual, do you think you would ever have had those great guidelines had people gone out and said, brothers, I believe in consensus? Of course you wouldn't. You'd have had nothing great, nothing of value.
I felt that being Prime Minister, she would want to try and bring the country together. That's what every Prime Minister up to that time had tried to do. But she didn't. She really did mean to fight consensus and to make people oppose each other and question each other's motives and so on.
The bureaucracy of Whitehall, the civil service, represented everything Margaret Thatcher believed was wrong with Britain.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
In her experience as Education Secretary, she'd found it feather-bedded, inefficient and overstaffed. Its culture of negotiation and committee, of consensus and compromise, horrified her.
It would be for you to take the final action, Secretary of State.
That wasn't the one I asked. It's the first one I asked.
Well,
Didn't ask about the last one. I have to approve it or say yea or nay.
I'm afraid that they had, as had been reported to me, absorbed some of the decline that was obviously accepted by past governments. Indeed, it was reported to me that one of the senior civil servants had said, our task now is the orderly management of decline.
The country has been in decline, whether you like it or not, and the task of the civil service has been to manage that decline, if you like to put it in that sense. The real crunch of the whole issue is that we've been in decline economically, and no government since the war, including Mrs. Thatcher's government, ever got back into a serious growth situation.
Margaret Thatcher reserved her most profound disdain for the Foreign Office. She regarded Britain's diplomats with deep suspicion, doubting their loyalty to the country and resenting their lofty manner.
I think perhaps the Foreign Office was more patronizing. They thought I didn't have much skill at diplomacy. Certainly diplomacy wasn't my forte. It was a policy that was right for Britain, which was my forte. And certainly I spoke with a directness, a truth and a strength to which they were not used, and they might even, some of them, have been shocked. After all, their whole culture was not sense of purpose, sense of direction. It was compromise, it was negotiation, it was diplomacy.
I feel very critical of her attitude to the Foreign Office because I think it did the Foreign Office a great deal of damage. And I think the fact that she knew that the Foreign Office, everybody knew she felt like this about the Foreign Office, weakened the Foreign Office's position. And I think it was a great pity.
The Foreign Office fought back, gaining Margaret Thatcher's grudging support for an end to the crisis in Rhodesia and forcing her to overcome her dread of foreigners. It was a fear she had to conquer during a trip to Africa or a Commonwealth conference.
As we were coming into land, she was toying with some dark glasses. It was night. She was toying with some dark glasses, so I said to her, what have you got these dark glasses for? And she said, well, I'm absolutely sure that I'm so unpopular that they're going to throw acid in my face. And so I'm going to put these dark glasses on. And I said, no, you've got it all wrong. Africans aren't like that at all. They won't do that. They may make a great noise and cheer and shout and whatnot, but they certainly won't do that. And at that moment we landed. It was pitch dark, and all you could see was a sea of faces surrounding the aircraft, and all waving and shouting. And the steps came down, and she got out of that airplane without the dark glasses, straight into the middle. And knowing what she'd said to me, I thought that was really pretty courageous.
For all her rhetoric, Margaret Thatcher was prepared to compromise when she had no alternative. In 1965, the white minority in the British colony of Rhodesia set up an illegal government. In the years that followed, black nationalists, led by Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, embarked on armed struggle. To Mrs. Thatcher, they were terrorists.
My instincts were, as they had always been, that you do not deal with terrorists. You never deal with people who want to get their way by the bullet and the bomb. When I got there, and we were going to have the duty of bringing the whole of Rhodesia to independence, to a proper British constitution, which involved full, free and fair democratic elections, it became quite clear to me that provided Mr. Nkomo and Mr. Mugabe were prepared to forego the bullet and the bomb in favour of the ballot box, then we should need to have them within negotiations.
After months of talks at Lancaster House, a new constitution was agreed. Margaret Thatcher's practical change of heart meant the Marxist Robert Mugabe became the first Prime Minister of independent Zimbabwe.
Her strategic objective was to solve the Rhodesian problem, which had bedeviled our foreign policy for so many years. And once she'd taken that decision, she was pragmatically prepared to accept the chips to fall wherever they might fall. And they fell somewhere which she would not have chosen.
But Margaret Thatcher was much harder to sway on the question of Europe. Given her suspicion of foreigners, she had an instinctive lack of sympathy for the European community.
My first visit to Strasbourg, too.
From the first, she saw it as a bureaucratic monolith and warned that Britain had been a soft touch for too long.
We weren't getting a fair deal on the budget, and I wasn't going to have it. There's a great strand of equity and fairness in the British view. This is our characteristic. There's not a strand of equity or fairness in Europe. It's they're out to get as much as they can. That's one of those enormous differences. So I tackled it on that basis, because if things went on as they were, we were going to pay the largest single contribution to Europe of the lot.
The Prime Minister demanded that the community should give Britain a £1 billion rebate and refused to countenance a penny less. The 1979 Dublin summit exposed the stunned European leaders to the full force of the Thatcher negotiating style.
It's that £1,000 million on which we started to negotiate because we want the greater part back. But it's not asking the community for money, it is asking the community to have our own money back.
She was pretty direct and pretty, not offensive exactly, but she went on and on about it, and the others became more and more put off by this, and Helmut Schmidt pretended he was asleep, and everybody else looked away, and it was a fairly dreadful occasion.
They were more or less, could one say so in English, alienated by the forceful tone in which she spoke and by the rigidity with which she fought for what she perceived as British interests. All of us have some national interests to defend, but all of us had learned over 30 years or so to come to compromises. And this is something which she hadn't started to learn as yet.
Although she had developed a rapport with Helmut Schmidt, she found the other European elder statesmen, particularly the French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, exasperating.
Do you know that diplomatic politeness? Rather lofty, rather patronizing. It wasn't my way. I wasn't prepared to deal that way.
We'd warned the community that we thought the budget was going to work to our disadvantage, and it began to do so, and it was absolutely right to try to settle that. It could be, and eventually was, settled by Lord Carrington in a way that was beneficial to British interest, but which could have been done without a lot of aggravation. I think that there are other issues as well, where her methods alienated people in Europe in a way that was unnecessary, and to that extent were not advantageous to British interests in Europe.
That's a Foreign Office view. I might say so. That's typical Foreign Office view. The cohesion of the community matters more than that a person like Britain should have a fair deal. There certainly was a Foreign Office view to that effect. A little bit of appeasement's a very good thing, because as the community goes on, my view was the community will only go on and only last if each and every person gets a reasonable, fair deal.
The Prime Minister eventually withdrew from the negotiations and left it to Lord Carrington to pick up the pieces. After an all-night session in Brussels, a compromise settlement was finally achieved. The community agreed that Britain should receive a rebate of 2/3 of the £1 billion Mrs. Thatcher had demanded. The team of Lord Carrington and his deputy Sir Ian Gilmore reported back, tired but triumphant, to the PM at Chequers.
We thought we'd done rather well. As a matter of fact, we had done rather well. And we were met at the front door by the Prime Minister, who quite clearly took the opposite view to that. She thought we'd done very badly. And so we were berated for a long time about what we'd agreed to.
There she was on the doorstep. She was incandescent. I mean, had we been bailiffs coming to take away the furniture from Chequers, I think we would have been more cordially received. She was like a sort of firework. And one could almost sort of hear her sizzling.
I was pretty blunt about it at first. It was not the agreement that I would have agreed. I think I would have gone for the rest. But that was I suppose that was the difference between Peter and I think he and Ian Gilmore had to fight the harder, because they knew that unless they did, I would have turned it down flat.
She'd invited us in. She could hardly fail to do that. And the atmosphere didn't improve when we got into one of the large rooms in Chequers. She said she couldn't possibly accept it, she'd resign.
We had one of those rather ridiculous conversations in which she said, "I'm not going to sign this, it's absurd. I shall resign." And so we said, "Well, of course you can't resign, we'll resign." It was that sort of conversation, and Ian and I left, and Ian said to me, "I'll tell you what I think I'll do. I'll go up to London and I'll brief the press that this has been a great triumph for Margaret Thatcher." And so all the press the next morning produced the stories that it had been a great triumph for her, which I think made it more difficult for her to resign. But I think I'm not sure we were forgiven for quite a bit.
Margaret Thatcher's direct manner in public and her relish for a fight soon became legendary, but in private, especially with officials and her personal staff, she presented a very different personality. She was renowned for her consideration and kindness to those who worked closely with her. But in her busy life, there was little time for the lighter side.
I think the first thing one has to remember is that life for her is a very serious matter indeed. It always has been. She's had to work very hard to get her position. She's had to work very hard as a woman to get on in politics, to get into a cabinet, to get on from that to be leader of a party, and to get on from that to being Prime Minister. There's not a time for a lot of jokes and amusement and the rest in her life. I don't think there ever will be.
Now I've found the right girl. Oh, what a girl. Oh, what a future. I'm in a well. She's got the beauty. She's got the grace. Oh, what a figure. And oh, what a face.
She was, a pretty girl, but she didn't seem to me to be have great fun exuding from her. But she did look. I thought that she looked to me as if she'd stepped straight out of The Sound of Music. She was a sort of pretty young schoolmistress from the Midlands. That was what was conveyed. And I don't think the girl in Sound of Music, was a riot of fun in that sense. She just burst into song occasionally, which Margaret certainly did not.
Now I've found the right girl. Oh, what a girl. Oh, what a future. I'm in a well.
I have seen her in Cornwall on holiday when someone accidentally put sea salt on their peaches and spat it out fairly quickly. I've seen her literally almost fall off the chair laughing. So the humour is there, but she takes life very seriously, and she also does not believe in wasting time in any way, and I think that is how she was brought up.
she would often go to the Sun for advice as to what might be the right line for Prime Minister's Question Time. Now, in those days, the editorials were carried on page 2 of the Sun, opposite page 3. And I remember the day when she dismissed us all as being silly men who knew nothing, and then she said, "Let's see what Larry has to say," dashed for her copy of the Sun and engrossed herself in the editorials in the Sun. And then, in front of us all, turned the paper round, held it out like that, and said, "What do you think of those two, then?" The 5 men in the room were left to their own thoughts at the time, each of us wondering who was going to laugh first. But somehow, none of us did. None of us did. We all chickened out. We had a jolly good laugh outside the door later, though.
While Margaret Thatcher may have been lacking in a sense of the absurd and unable to appreciate the clubby innuendos of her male colleagues, she didn't shrink from using sex to her advantage. She was always responsive to men who knew how to treat her as a woman.
She approached her male colleagues in a much more flirtatious way and got them to bend to her will with a wonderful skill that was wholly female and totally feminine. What I think they were not used to was this curious mixture of flirtatiousness and dominance which Mrs. Thatcher exhibited.
We had a big industrialist conference in Glasgow, and she had a cold. She was going to address it. We were standing behind the stage, and Jim Pryor came up to her and he said, "I heard you on the radio last night, Margaret." He said, "You were very good." He said, you sounded very sexy. Have you got a cold?" And she looked him straight in the eye and she said, "Jim, I don't need a cold to be sexy." And, I mean, the poor fellow, he'd got a fairly florid complexion anyway, but he blushed red, and he just didn't know, I mean, how to deal with it. She knew how to play the sort of female part. She played it unmercifully on occasions.
Some of these good-looking men who were around the place, like Humphrey Atkins and Cecil Parkinson and a number of others, she undoubtedly had a very soft spot for them, found it very hard to resist them. Didn't find it so hard to resist me, but that's another matter.
Margaret Thatcher, the politician, was always happy to exploit her understanding of what it meant to be a woman to explain her economic philosophy. In simple terms, and at every opportunity, she compared the management of the British economy to the budget of a housewife.
Brown bread, brown Cox's apples.
Yes.
How much are the Cox's apples?
But I knew that every housewife would understand what I was doing. After all, she has her own budget. She knows that if she spends more on one thing, she's got to spend less on another. And if she has something to buy that costs more and she borrows, she mustn't let herself get into too much debt. Otherwise, she'll never be able to repay. That's exactly what I was doing with the nation's budget.
The whole analogy between the government and the housewife is completely flawed. The point is, the housewife does know what money is coming in. She does know what she's going to have to spend. The government doesn't, and certainly didn't in Mrs. Thatcher's time. They didn't know what was coming in, they didn't know what was going out. There's no analogy at all, and one of the many reasons for the disaster, and it was a disaster from which we're still suffering, that desperate depression of 1979, 1981, was this idiocy about the housewife's budget.
The Prime Minister was determined that the same strict lessons in good housekeeping should apply to the country's nationalised industries. She regarded them as union-dominated, inefficient and ripe for privatisation. In January 1980, a strike began of the loss-making British Steel. For Margaret Thatcher, the dispute was the first opportunity to demonstrate her iron will to fight the unions and force them to reform. She and Keith Joseph insisted that the market and not old-style collective bargaining should determine the outcome of the strike. Joseph went to the very heart of the dispute to preach the gospel of the free market, but his words fell on stony ground.
I remember on one such occasion, when I was being more or less mobbed, that a steel worker thrust his face close to mine and said, "You've taken my job." And I said to this relatively young man, "I haven't. Your customers have. You've priced yourself out of the market. You and your managements." So I was perhaps arrogantly sure that I was right, that they were in process of committing industrial suicide.
For Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher, the steel strike epitomised all that was bad about the British economy. They wanted to tear down the whole framework of outdated British industrial practice. Unions, management, state monopolies would have to reform or die, whatever the cost in job losses and factory closures. Only then could the enterprise economy be reborn. The price in human terms was very high. For the first time since the war, unemployment rose above 2 million and looks set to reach 3 million, a figure thought incredible only a few years before. Many of Mrs. Thatcher's colleagues were horrified.
She's quite human enough to understand that unemployment is a misfortune for every family that experiences it. But I think she, in her mind, rather cast that thought to one side and attached much more importance to the success of everybody who was still in work.
This division went to the heart of Mrs. Thatcher's government and highlighted the different social attitudes in her cabinet. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, himself a wealthy hereditary peer, epitomised the outlook of the grandees with their deep-seated sense of duty and responsibility.
There was quite a considerable wing of the Conservative Party who felt that those who were better off had some obligation to help those who were not so better off, particularly those who were not better off because through no fault of their own, because they were handicapped in some way or another. I don't mean physically handicapped, but handicapped one way or another.
I would counter that very toughly and very firmly. Certainly those who had inherited quite a lot, which most of us hadn't, seemed to have something of a guilt complex, which the rest of us who'd worked up our way didn't have. I thought it was quite wrong to have a guilt complex. The more you've inherited, the greater your duty to do things, but don't try to take it out of the policies that create the wealth.
Part of her strength was that she was going to go for what she thought was a better long-term solution. And if it had proved to be so, who would criticize her? But as we know, unfortunately, it didn't quite work out like that.
The cabinet was at war. Sometimes openly, but more often privately, many of Margaret Thatcher's colleagues criticised her economic policies and called upon her to make a U-turn, just as Edward Heath had done in the early 70s.
It was irritating that they weren't prepared to stand up for what they'd agreed in Cabinet, but it was also irritating because it was because we had done a U-turn in the previous Conservative government that we had lost, because people had lost respect for the government, and the policies, far from taking us out of trouble, had taken us right into trouble.
It was at this time the term of abuse, wet, came into fashion to describe critics on the left of the Conservative Party. The wets were the moderate Tories.
We're getting wet.
Nearly half the cabinet, the patricians, the Heathites, the grandees, all of whom detested Thatcherism.
To start with, I hated being called a wet. I thought it was highly insulting, which of course it was meant to be. and it was meant to undermine our position. I mean, we talk about loyalty, but I mean, it's not very easy to show great loyalty to a leader who has let it be known that you're wet, and that you're all wet. I mean, actually, what the hell were we doing there if we were that wet anyhow?
And at the 1980 party conference, the divisions in the cabinet came to a head. The Wets were now in open rebellion. Margaret Thatcher's survival in the face of the Wet onslaught depended on the support of one of their number, the Home Secretary and Deputy Leader, Willie Whitelaw. Whitelaw was a natural Wet, a landed gentleman of the old school. But once she'd won, he never flinched in his belief that loyalty to the leader counted above all else.
I am, however, very fortunate in having a marvellous deputy who's wonderful in all places, at all times, in all things, Willie Whitelaw.
He abdicated his judgment, really, and abdicated himself in favour of her, of Mrs. Thatcher, and did just what he was told, and that was very useful from the point of view of getting her policies through, but, as I say, I think damaging to the country.
And Gilmore may think that, and for all I know, that may, to some extent, be right. But what was the result? The result was that the Conservative Party won the election in 1979 and stayed in power for 10 years. Is it supposed that that could have happened if the Tory party had constantly been quarrelling with its leader throughout that time? The answer is no.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to.
Margaret Thatcher's answer to her critics was emphatic.
The ladies not for turning.
But as she stuck firm to policy, the economy continued to deteriorate disastrously. Many companies went bankrupt. Inflation reached 22%. Interest rates were historically high. Nearly 15% of Britain's manufacturing base disappeared. In a series of attacks in speeches and in newspaper articles, the Wets took their battle outside the cabinet and criticised the Prime Minister openly.
Once you lose industry, once you lose the ability to manufacture in a certain commodity, it's very hard, if not impossible, to get it back or to win those markets back. And we lost a lot of markets at that time, both home and overseas, and we've paid the penalty of that ever since. And we said so at the time, and we got no response from Margaret because it was not part of the doctrine.
I must tell you that I think that women have very much more experience of taking tough decisions than men. After all, often we're left carrying the can. And I think that they resented that, but I knew that if we were to get through, we had to be tough, and it was second nature to me. They had that biblical weakness, some of them, not all of them, some of them. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. They like to be acclaimed, they like to preen themselves. And also, let me say this, I think, but they really thought that the grocer's daughter didn't really know how things were done.
Behind the doors of Number 10, Margaret Thatcher's advisers warned her that the recession was now in danger of becoming a permanent slump. Government spending appeared out of control. Inflation and interest rates were both up. Margaret Thatcher ordered yet more harsh medicine, reduced government spending and higher taxes. In March 1981, Mrs. Thatcher's Chancellor, Sir Geoffrey Howe, announced a budget which duly raised taxes and cut public borrowing. To do this at a time of recession went against all conventional economic wisdom. 364 economists wrote to the newspapers attacking the Chancellor. Their letter argued that unless economic policy was changed, disaster would follow.
Well, I think the proof of that pudding was in the eating, was it not? Because we made no changes save to sustain our policy in the direction to which we were already committed. And within 12 months from that time, economic recovery had started. Over the next 8 years, as I say, we had the longest and strongest rate of economic growth in our economic history. We got inflation down to less than 3%.
In fact, unemployment went on rising for more than 5 years after the 1981 budget. It went on rising till July, August 1986. In other words, we were in a growth recession from 1981 to 1986. The recovery from the 1981 recession, although it was much the worst, much the deepest since the war, the recovery was far slower than any previous recession. So how the Thatcherites make a triumph out of that, I simply don't understand.
In the summer of 1981, riots broke out in the inner cities. As social disorder spread, so did the anxiety about the effect of Margaret Thatcher's policies. The concern was not confined to politicians alone.
I went from Canterbury to London every week, once or twice, and I could see areas of gradually increasing prosperity, like Canterbury, and I could see areas of economic decline and physical decay and social disintegration in all the streets as I came into London, with boarded up shops and graffiti and a sense of aimlessness about the back streets behind them. We'd already seen one consequence in the rioting. It seemed to me that we accepted the need for wealth creation, and we saw that a cost had to be paid for that. But we thought that the cost was unjustly distributed.
Throughout the summer of 1981, disturbances continued in 30 of Britain's most deprived inner-city areas. London, Bristol, Leeds, Manchester and Liverpool were all affected. To the wets in the cabinet, as to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the riots were a terrible vindication of their concerns about the nature and direction of economic policy. When Margaret Thatcher visited Liverpool, she utterly rejected any link between crime and social conditions. To her, it was the liberal attitudes of earlier decades which threatened a breakdown in family life.
When I was their age, our own area had its own standards and its own taboos. There was a period, I think in the 60s, when so many of them were broken down. And people forgot that you cannot have freedom unless you have order. You cannot have order unless you obey the law.
In July of that year, at the height of the riots, the Cabinet met to discuss the annual round of public spending. Once again, Margaret Thatcher and her economic team called for further cuts. Now, the Cabinet itself threatened a riot.
I knew there were people going to jib at cutting public expenditure to keep within the limits. And I'd heard all the rumours, what they were going to say, how they were going to play it. And I said to Dennis, I'm not going to go on unless we can keep the policy going. This is what I came in to do for Britain, and I can't go on unless we can carry that out. So don't be surprised if I come up and say, I've got to resign, I haven't got through.
People were very jittery, and I think we thought that there had to be some easing of public expenditure and some more attention to social policy and educational policy and unemployment policy and so on. And Margaret herself was very uneasy at that time. She hated going to the House of Commons on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and being attacked on unemployment in the way that she was.
Now even some of Margaret Thatcher's earliest and most loyal supporters turned against her. John Nott, a brilliant but nervous economist, said that enough was enough. The Lord Chancellor, Quintin Hailsham, warned of the dangers of the rise of fascism. Even John Biffin, once regarded as an arch monetarist, now changed his tune and urged a change in policy.
My name was mud with some of my colleagues. They always wanted, some of them, an easy way, but I always had enough to get us through. I had said right at the beginning, when I knew the enormity of the task, the running up the down escalator, give me 6 strong men and true, and we'll get through. I don't think I ever had 6 at any one time, but I had enough with Willie Whitelaw, who'd always back me when he knew and understood that this was in the heart of our policy.
Were it not for Willie Whitelaw, Margaret Thatcher might not have survived. After the bitter battle of the July cabinet, she decided that she would take no more. The Wets returned from their summer break to meet their end. Her principal opponent, Jim Pryor, was removed from the core economic team and replaced by the tinder-dry Norman Tebbit. Ian Gilmore was sacked. The Wets had never united in their opposition to policy.
Nothing to say at this stage about my future.
Nor had they taken the alternative course and resigned.
I think that there is a strong case for saying that it would have been better if a number of us had resigned. On the other hand, what that would have done to the parliamentary party at a time when we had a relatively small majority and when we were deeply unpopular in the country, it's very hard to say. I think it might have brought down the government. Certainly if all those who had strong disagreement with the policy had resigned, it would have brought down the government. And we weren't elected to, as it were, to resign on and bring down the government. So we stuck in there.
In the autumn after the Wets' departure, Mrs. Thatcher's popularity appeared to hit a new low. Opinion polls accorded her the dubious accolade of being the most unpopular Prime Minister since polling began.
Popularity isn't the thing. They respect you if you have the guts to do what is right and to stick to it. And the essence of a good Prime Minister is not whether they are popular, but whether they are respected because they did things that was right for Britain and which raised the standard and standing of our country. Those we did. And so, in a way, the benefit came later when we won the 1983 election with a much, much bigger majority. That's the true opinion poll.
The battle with the Wets had tested the Prime Minister's mettle, and she had demonstrated her ability to fight and defeat her political opponents. Another quite unexpected conflict was soon to test her once more, this time in the international arena. She would emerge from it victorious and more dominant than ever. At the heart of her character lay a relish, even a love, for strife and friction. It was her greatest strength, but it was also to prove in the coming years her greatest weakness.